Thank you. I call upon Professor William Hurd, University of Alabama School of Medicine, USA. William Hurd is a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Alabama School of Medicine and professor emeritus of obstetrics and gynecology at Duke University. He maintained a nationally funded basic science laboratory for more than 2 decades studying the physiology of myometrial contractility. He has published over 200 scholarly articles and book chapters and is the co-editor of the textbook Clinical Reproductive Medicine and Surgery Now. Now it is in fourth edition. He has served as a president of the Society of Reproductive Surgeons and the Council for Gynecological Excellence, as well as chief medical officer of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. Okay, Dr. William.
Thank you.
So, sorry for my English. I am not a native English speaker. And William Hurd, I am of your student, and I study your book in preparing my RCOG exam.
I'm honored. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? So, there's a little one here, but it's not good enough. Okay. This one better? Okay. So we're going to change a little bit now. Now that can you hear this at all?
Yeah, but one is for the online.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
They can hear that. Okay, very good. We'll do both. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to change, and I'm assuming some of the people in the audience are OBGYN people who have been involved in labor and delivery, and I'm assuming other people actually have had babies in the audience, which is more than I've done, of course. I actually worked on this talk for a mixed audience with my wife, who is a labor and delivery nurse, and she was really enthusiastic about how it brought science that she was not aware of to something she could understand. This is the first new theory on the onset of labor in probably 80 years. And for those who watch labor like obstetricians, it might answer some of the questions you've had about why things happen as they do. So let's see if I can get this to work. Let's see. Which button makes it go forward? None of them. Oh, okay. That'll work. Okay. No. Stuck. Well, this is going to be a very... Yeah, that's the one I tried. How about this one? There we go. Okay, so I'll do that one. That'll work. Okay, great. Very, very good. So basically, let's move forward here. Let me try here. First off, let's get on the same page of what happens. There's some amazing changes in labor, and basically they evolve around uterine volume and contractile activity. So what happens is your uterus goes from a very small potential space of 5 ml to 4,500 ml over 9 months without contractions. Now, when you're in a non-pregnant uterus, if you even put a small thing in it, the uterus contracts. So why is it all of a sudden with a growing fetus, the uterus doesn't contract? And then all of a sudden, almost magically, you start having contractions, and then over 12 to 24 hours, the uterus decreases back in size almost to its original size. For those of you familiar with the physiology of smooth muscle, as the smooth muscle gets smaller, the contractile activity decreases. So what is it that helps you continue to have contractions instead of them going away? And then probably the most remarkable thing is that at delivery, when the uterus empties, there's a big contracture. At any gestation, it doesn't have to be a term. It could be a 25 weeks hysterotomy for a preterm C-section or an incompetent cervix. If it didn't do that, there would be some bad outcomes. So basically the contemporary research has been looking at as the uterus enlarges, it becomes more contractile. And this is certainly a fact. They call these inflammatory changes partially because they involve prostaglandins, as you'll see is very important, is what we're talking about too. The hypothesis that I came up with over the last 30 years really isn't against this, it works with this. So basically, what is it that makes this happen? Well, what is the only predictor of labor that we know about? It's not the contractile state of the uterus, it's basically the cervical softening. Cervical softening, called ripening by some people, is the effacement and dilatation. Effacement is the thinning of the uterus, and dilatation, of course, is when it dilates. And on ultrasound, this looks like shortening, which can be quantified better that way. Now, this picture here, it shows that the cervix is very thick and long before it softens, and then it effaces, it becomes thinner, and then eventually it starts dilating. And this is very important because this is the thing that predicts labor. So could there be an interaction between that increased contractility that we know happens and the cervical softening? Well, it turns out if you read physiology textbooks about labor, they're totally at odds with the experts in labor onset. And what they say is that labor is a positive feedback loop. Now, a positive feedback loop is one of the less common things in interactions in physiology, and basically is something that magnifies. The standard thing is a negative feedback loop, such as if your temperature goes up, you sweat. If it goes down, you shiver. These are the negative feedback loops that keep you at a standard temperature. Well, positive feedback amplifies the activity and goes from one standard level of interactions to another one, such as blood clotting, urination, and perhaps labor. Well, what's this based on? Basically, 80 years ago, if anyone has studied obstetrics, has heard about the Ferguson reflex. And what this is basically he hypothesized in 1941, I think, that contractile activity opened the cervix. The cervix would then have a connection to the contractility to increase it, and this would be the positive feedback loop. And what he said basically was there was a neurologic connection between the cervix and the pituitary, which releases oxytocin, and that increases contractile activity, and there's a positive feedback loop. Well, there was a little problem with this, and that's basically there is no neurologic connection that's anyone's ever found in 80 years, and there's not a physiologic increase in oxytocin levels. So the question is, could there, and finally, after cervical dilatation, if this was what caused labor, labor would stop because the cervix is totally dilated. So what could be the connection between cervical dilatation and contractile activity that would cause labor? Well, basically, we believe that there's a positive feedback loop between contractile activity and myometrial shortening, and the connection is prostaglandin F2 alpha, which is a powerful contractile agonist. So the question is, what are these connections? Well, the first one that I'm going to show you is cervical effacement and dilatation. But again, after that cervix is completely dilated, what's next is decreasing uterine volume. Now, first, let's talk a little bit about myometrial shortening. It happens in every pregnancy, but people really haven't focused on it. During labor, contractions cause myometrial shortening, but only when it's allowed by two familiar processes, which I just mentioned: cervical effacement and dilatation, and uterine emptying. So let's talk about dilatation and effacement first. Got to go backwards one. No, boy. Let's see here. Okay. So basically, effacement starts late in pregnancy. As everyone knows that's done obstetrics, the cervix starts effacing well before labor, and then it sometimes even starts dilating, then all of a sudden labor starts. This continues in labor until complete dilation, and it allows cervical shortening I mean, myometrial shortening by basically taking up some of the circumference of the uterus. The uterus doesn't change in size, but what was myometrium down here before becomes cervix. And then as it dilates, it takes there's even less of the circumference that the myometrium has to take up. So this is what shortens it. You can estimate that just the effacement shortens the myometrium by about 10%, and the dilation shortens it by another 14%. Once dilation completely occurs, then fetal egress and delivery shortens it. Now, this is more obvious and more intuitive to most people. Basically, as the uterus empties, it gets smaller, and the myometrium shortens till it's emptied. This can be estimated from complete dilation to crowning, decreases it by 24% more, and then the final shortening as the uterus empties is about 32%, for a total of 80% shortening over that 12 hours of labor. What prevents this? Well, number one by far is the cervix. If the cervix is firm, then it can't dilate in the face, and it keeps the uterus, the fetus, from leaving the uterus. Early on, if it becomes effaced, what happens? Incompetent cervix. And at any gestation, if the cervix is incompetent, even when there's no increased contractility, it will start contracting and the baby will deliver, as we're all aware who've done obstetrics. Near term, we've seen people that are 3 or 4 centimeters dilated, especially if they've had a previous baby and they don't go into labor. Well, birth canal resistance takes over. If the fetus is big enough, the size of the presenting part trying to get through the birth canal has enough resistance that the uterus can't continue to contract or get shortened. So let's now go through this hypothesis step by step, just to make it a little clearer. Basically, in late pregnancy, the myometrial contractility is increasing, and women notice more contractions, false labor, labor pains, and basically this contractility increases. And at the same time, based on the inflammatory response and prostaglandins, the cervix gets softer. But until this contractility is greater than the cervical resistance, it can't continue to shorten. Once the cervix, the contractions get strong enough, or the cervix gets soft enough, then the contractile activity can cause cervical dilation and effacement to continue, which causes myometrial shortening and releases prostaglandin F2 alpha, and this is labor. So this is the positive feedback loop early in pregnancy that starts labor and continues till complete dilation. Now, once you get complete dilation, this feedback loop is stopped. You can't dilate more than that. So what allows the cervix to shorten more? Basically, is decreasing uterine volume. The contractile activity continues, the fetus starts leaving the uterus, and this allows the volume to decrease, as we talked about. And again, prostaglandin F2 alpha from the shortening, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then finally, at the very end, the uterus is totally empty. So you have contractile activity with pushing, and with a good deal of effort, there's delivery. The uterus completely empties, and at any gestation, the massive myometrial shortening releases prostaglandin, and this causes uterine contracture, which is a giant contraction at the end that's necessary to stop the bleeding from the placental separation at any gestation. So what's the evidence supporting this? We're going to talk about research evidence and the clinical data observation. There's a whole lot of them, but in a short talk, we really can't talk about all of them. Probably the biggest deal is myometrial shortening and prostaglandin F2 alpha. Where's that from? Is that ever been looked at in the laboratory? It turns out it has. This is what my laboratory, funded by the NIH and the American Heart Association, looked at for several years. And basically, we took uterine strips from C-sections and hung them in vitro and watched them. Then we put them at tension because they kind of shrink as soon as you take them out of the uterus, because that's what myometrium does. And then we'd shorten them by 14% or lengthen them by 14%, and then shorten them to see what would do contractions, and compared them. And this is what we found. In the full-length strips, which are the black squares, the contractions decreased when you stretch them. And then we shortened them by 4%. The contractions increased pretty remarkably. But this tended to be a temporary thing. It started after about 45 minutes to an hour, and then after about 2 hours, it stopped. So this is a temporary thing. And we compare those to the ones that we just kept, we put with indomethacin, which inhibits prostaglandin production. And what we found that the ones that were shortened, it dramatically decreased the contractility. Now, if you've ever done experiments like this, you could probably put anything in there like battery acid, and it would decrease contractility. So this doesn't prove that it has to do with prostaglandins. But then we looked at the strips that were still kept at full length, and amazingly enough, these are the full-length strips, and when we inhibited prostaglandin, it increased the contractility in these strips that weren't contracting very much. So what is that all about? Well, it took our lab a couple of years to get going on this, but what we then did, the obvious thing, is we measured the prostaglandins in these strips. And the ones we measure are PGF2 alpha, the most potent contractile agonist, and PGI2, prostacyclin, which decreases the contractility. And we actually measure the stable metabolite of it because it's a very short half-life to see what is this doing with the stretching and shortening. And what we found is when we shorten these strips, it increased the prostaglandin F2 alpha, just as we were hoping it did. We weren't sure it was going to do this, but it certainly did in a dose-dependent manner. And amazingly enough, when we left them long, basically the long strips had increased PGI2, which causes relaxation. So although this wasn't what our original hypothesis was, basically as the pregnant uterus expands, it makes more relaxing prostaglandin as it's allowed you to contract and shorten. It makes more of the contractile one. So in essence, what we're saying is shortening increases this is the prostaglandin cascade. Prostaglandins are made from membranes, and it will show you about how much is made by the uterus. And it can either go to PGF2 alpha or PGI2, and shortening or stretching determines which way it goes. So let's now just briefly talk about some of the most dramatic clinical evidence. We're going to talk about cervical softening predicting preterm labor, which I mentioned briefly, PGF2 alpha, what it does in labor. Probably the one that first caught my attention as a resident, longer than some of you were born here, was that in dystocia, when the baby's not coming down, the contraction goes away. And why is that? What's going on there? And then finally about the uterine contracture. So let's talk about the cervical softness in labor. Basically, a long time ago in '64, a bishop felt the cervix clinically and showed that the softer it was, the more likely you were to go into labor. So this is nothing new, but it's an important finding. Why would the cervix be associated with that? The more contemporary stuff is ultrasound evaluation of the length of the cervix. This is the baby's head. This is the cervix coming off the end of the head, and you can see how long it is. And then here you can see it's called funneling, but the cervix becomes much shorter, and it predicts labor quite nicely, preterm labor and at term. And interestingly enough, if you look at ultrasound during labor, you can see that dynamic shortening occurs with labor onset. According to the theory that I just said, of course, when the cervix is soft enough, the contractile activity, when it's greater than the cervical resistance, results in a positive feedback loop. And that's how they're connected that way. Well, prostaglandins, what do they do in labor? Actually, prostaglandins do go up during labor and go back down. And according to the hypothesis, this is due to myometrial shortening. Well, where does this oh, shoot. Oh, this won't be too good. Okay. Okay, where does this come from? Primarily, it comes from myometrium. The membranes and the placenta both make prostaglandins too. Membranes make a little more per milligram, but the uterus weighs 20 times as much as the membrane. So the main circulating prostaglandins you say are from the uterus, as far as we know. Interestingly enough, shoot, okay, that was really not the right thing. Okay, sorry about this. Okay. Well, we might be done sharing here. Well, at least we got that part. Okay. Interestingly enough, the circulating prostaglandin levels are nowhere near what you would need to have an effect on circulating levels on contractions. The ED50 of prostaglandin is 700,000 greater than the increased level. So what this in essence means is the prostaglandin levels that we see circulating are probably not affecting the uterus. They're probably caused from the uterus, and they're unlikely to initiate labor. And so it's probably a pericrine and autocrine effect in the uterine tissue. The uterine tissue makes more prostaglandins, and it causes contractions, then it's released into the circulation. This is, again, one of the most exciting ones to me. In labor, we're sitting there watching labor, and all of a sudden, if the baby stops coming down, contractions stop. At this point, we're not sure. Is the contractions is the baby not coming down causing the contractions to stop, or is the weak labor causing the contractions, the baby not to come down? And so what we do is we give oxytocin, a strong stimulant of contractions. And what we find is if the baby starts coming down, there's good contractions. The contractions get good and they stay good. If the baby does not come down, the contractions start good and then they slowly go away. Why would that be? Why can you not get good labor if the baby doesn't come down? Well, again, according to the hypothesis, the uterus has to shorten to make prostaglandins to have good labor. So you can stimulate the shortening a little bit with oxytocin, but eventually, if the baby can't come down, the uterus stretches as far as it can on the bottom and shortens at the top, and then it's done. So basically, it is a factor of the can it shorten or not. And then the final thing is, when you deliver a baby, there's massive prostaglandin release. The uterus has a contracture. And what some people say, well, maybe it's due to the blood because the blood is a strong stimulator of contraction. But the truth is the uterus contracts before the placenta separates. Matter of fact, it is responsible for the placenta separating. And then once the placenta separates, then the blood certainly can continue to make it contract. And the thing that really throws people off is they think of the uterus as like a big balloon, that when you empty it, it just comes right down. That's not right. And the truth is, it's not a balloon. I guess that's not going to happen. So it does not go down like a balloon. It's not elastic. In the post-mortem situation, if you do an autopsy on someone with a pregnant uterus, you take the baby out, it's a flaccid bag. And we know in our contractions experiments, when you first take it out, it contracts immediately. But then once it's non-viable, it's just flaccid. There's no elasticity in it. And so according to the hypothesis we just talked about, it has to be able to shorten and continue to shorten and make prostaglandins that work intrinsically. So basically, who cares? Why does this matter? The two biggest problems with maternal health in pregnancy are, number one, premature labor, a big problem for the babies, which we can always stop. But once we stop it, as soon as you stop the contractions and it starts again. Why is that? Well, if the cervical resistance is less than the contractility, then in essence, that's not going to stop it. Sometimes early on, you can use a stitch to do that, but that doesn't work later. And it's a giant problem we have not been able to master over the last 30 years. And then uterinectomy and bleeding after delivery, apnea is when the uterus does not contract down, remains one of the leading causes of maternal death throughout the world. And if we had a different understanding of what that's due to, we might be able to do something more than we've had for the last half of a century. So basically, thank you for listening to this thing. I hope it was of some interest to you. And do you have any questions?
William, so I will invite myself to facilitate you with the keynote speaker certificate.
Okay. Good. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you all for letting me be part of your conference. This has been a very interesting thing. I'm obviously an old male from a different part of the world, this is a problem, as you probably know, everywhere, but it varies from area to area. And of course, we got a lot of problems in the world right now. But thank you so much.